My name is John Sylvester. I'm Australia's longest serving crime reporter and write a weekly column for The Age. Many of my colleagues have wondered why I've never bothered to move to other areas of the paper. The reason's pretty simple. I've got the best job in journalism, playing cops and robbers and getting paid for it. Over more than 40 years I've covered some of Australia's biggest crimes and met fascinating characters on both sides of the law. In this series, you'll hear from them, the cops and the crooks, telling their stories. Welcome to my world. Welcome to Naked City. Peter Norris Dupas is the worst type of serial killer, and police believe he stalked women for decades and was responsible for 6 murders. He had been convicted of the murder of Nicole Patterson, killed in her home in April 1999. He was also convicted of the murder of Margaret Maher, who was killed in October 1997. He was the only suspect in the murder of Mersina Halvagis, who was only 25 years old when she was stabbed to death in November 1997 while tending her grandmother's grave.
Mersina Halvagis's body was found close to her grandmother's grave in the northeastern corner of the Fawkner Cemetery. She had been stabbed and there were signs of a struggle. Police say the bank employee who regularly visited the grave had driven her fiancé's car to the cemetery about 4 o'clock yesterday afternoon, where she bought flowers. When she failed to return to her parents' home, a search began. Her fiancé found his car in the cemetery car park about 4:30 this morning. Ms. Halvagis's body was located soon after. Police today searched for the murder weapon, believed to be a knife. So far, there are no clues to the motive for the killing.
Elite homicide investigator Jeff Maher charged Dupas with the Nicole Patterson murder.
Now, interviewing Dupas always gave me the feeling that he was standing on the edge of the abyss and he was sort of ready to fall in at any moment. But at that crucial time, he would just snap out of it and then step back from the abyss.
And years later, Paul Scarlett charged him over Margaret Maher.
We saw that on many occasions when he might talk to us generally, but then as soon as we would go or commence the interview process, he would stop and he would just, it's like a screen goes up and he just goes blank.
It looked as though Dupas would never be called to account over Mersina Halvagis, as prosecutor Paul Coghlan QC lacked that one vital piece of evidence.
He has to be one of the most evil people we've dealt with, but we had got to a point where we just didn't have enough.
But eventually, the final piece of the jigsaw fell into place, and it came from the most unlikely source.
And he just started, and he said, Mersina. So I thought, here we go. I thought then, he's going to kill me.
For 10 years, the family of Mersina had been looking for answers. Mersina Halvagis's father, George, lobbied tirelessly in the case. He refused to let the case be shelved. He went to politicians, lawyers, the media, and in 2004, a $1 million reward was offered in the case.
The victim's 2 brothers and sister have pleaded on behalf of the family for public help in solving the brutal slaying.
And we just really want to know why and who, and so if anyone sees anything, doesn't matter how minuscule it looks or how insignificant, if they can just let the police know. Please.
Nothing's going to make it better now to lose my sister, my best friend. But if we can just come to some sort of conclusion, at least I may be able to move on.
He's the most beautiful, nicest, most caring person out of anyone.
And throughout today, police sought clues from hundreds of people attending the cemetery.
The police were convinced it was Dupas. They found that he'd frequented the area. They had witnesses who could identify him or someone like him in the Fawkner Cemetery. He drank at the local hotel and had a propensity for such crimes. But the ultimate decision whether Dupas would be prosecuted was left to the Director of Public Prosecutions, Paul Coghlan QC. The police were devastated when Coghlan said, "Look, you just don't have enough evidence." While Scarlett and Maher were convinced that Dupas was the offender, there was no forensic evidence to prove it. No matter how many times they interviewed him over the Halvagis murder, they knew he would never confess. But there would be a breakthrough, and it would come from the strangest possible source. Andrew Fraser, a defence lawyer the police love to hate. The reason was they believed Fraser was off reservation, that he was too close to the crooks and he would use any trick in the book to get his clients off. The relationship between police and defence lawyers is usually a professional one, even though they have conflicting interests. The lawyer wants an acquittal and the cops want a conviction. Usually everyone understands and respects their roles as long as everyone plays within the rules. Some were delighted when Fraser crashed and burned due to his $1,000 a day cocaine habit. In December 2001, he was sentenced to a minimum of 5 years after pleading guilty to knowingly being concerned with the importation of cocaine, trafficking cocaine, and possession of ecstasy.
Mr. Fraser was arrested outside his offices late yesterday and charged with being knowingly concerned with the importation of 5.5 kilograms of cocaine seized in Sydney in September. Federal agent Tina Westret told Melbourne Magistrates Court Mr. Fraser had given specific instructions on how to successfully import a narcotic and how to evade police detection during intercepted conversations. The instructions included what to do once the alleged courier got through customs, the use of public phone boxes and code names. Con Heliotis said Mr. Fraser had admitted he was a chronic drug addict and would plead guilty to possessing, using and trafficking cocaine for his own use.
He was a first-time, non-violent offender and was not an escape risk. He should have gone to a medium security prison where he could have taught English to struggling inmates. But police enemies with long memories wanted him to do his time hard. Intelligence was fed into the system that his life was at risk and he needed protection. He was taken in shackles to Sirius East, a division in Port Phillip prison that housed up to 38 of the most detested and dangerous inmates in Victoria.
I'd been originally arrested in 1999 on bail for a couple of years and then sentenced to 7 years with a minimum of 5, and I was sent against my will.
Andrew and I had a competitive relationship. After he was released from prison, I reached out to see if he'd talk. We met at a trendy South Melbourne cafe where he said, "I don't know whether to have a coffee with you or punch you in the mouth." I suggested we started with a coffee and see how we went. His story was quite remarkable, and he agreed to tell it on tape to The Age.
And I was sent against my will, I hasten to add, to protection from protection in a unit called Sirius East at Port Phillip. Dupas was already there serving 2 life sentences.
On his first day in the unit, he was about to go back to his cell at mealtime when he heard a voice call out, "Sit here, Andrew." It was Peter Norris Dupas.
Andrew, when did you first meet Peter Dupas?
2002 in February.
And when you first met him, did you pal up with him or?
Pal up's a difficult expression, really. The situation is there were 2 very distinct gangs within the unit, and not to be at least associated with one was very dangerous. Dupas asked me to have lunch with him one day, and I sat down, and from then on I was more or less in his group.
Fraser and Dupas became the jail's odd couple, tending the division's vegetable patch and watching gardening shows together.
And you and Dupas would do the gardening there?
Yes, I got the gardener's. He was always the gardener, and I obtained the gardener's job a couple of months later. So we were gardening together for probably 12 to 14 months.
They would garden outside and chat. Soon Dupas decided to use Fraser as his unpaid legal advisor.
I was the gardener with him. He would talk to me. I was more or less became his on-tap legal advice.
So he was showing you things like brief of evidence and...
Oh yes, most certainly. It started even when he got the 464 application, which is a police application to a court for him to be interviewed out of time. The minute he got that, he raced up to see me about it. He showed me the Halvagis brief. He showed me the Maher brief before Halvagis. And he used me to help him. I read it, I told him what the problems were. And it was clear from the Maher brief that there was similar fact evidence.
When was the first sort of admission that Dupas made which made you connect him to the Mersina Halvagis murder?
The first time was we were walking in what's called the chook pen, which is an exercise yard at the back of the unit, and you can go there any time. But looking out from the chook pen is a garden where other units can go at particular times. And a young bloke was walking around in the garden. We were in the chook pen. He stopped at the fence, young Greek-looking fellow, and he started screaming at Dupas about him knowing who he was. He knew he killed his cousin Mersina, and if he got half a chance, he'd kill him. Well, Dupas stopped as if somebody had punched him in the face. He actually stopped like that and turned around and said to me, "How does that see? No, I did it." Now, some people could say that's a question. To me, it was clearly an admission.
After Dupas was interviewed by police, he returned to the division shaken and made a series of admissions to Fraser, including saying there was no forensic evidence at the Fawkner Cemetery linking him to Mersina's death, and that the victim didn't even see it coming.
And he kept saying to me, "Look, I just didn't leave any forensic evidence at Fawkner. There's no forensic evidence at Fawkner." Just kept repeating that sort of thing. Now, if that's not an admission, I don't know what is. And then one day in the cell, we were talking about the Maher brief, and I said, "I reckon you're a huge chance to be pinched with Halvagis as well." We were sitting on his bed, so doorway there, me on one end of the bed, Dupas at the other end of the bed. There's an intercom system on the wall, window, and he'd said something along the lines of he'd left no forensic evidence, or there was no forensic evidence at Fawkner, and if you weren't the killer, you wouldn't know that. And all of a sudden, he pointed at the intercom on the wall and went.
He gestures to Andrew to remain silent.
To say shut up, because all the crooks have this idea that, whether it's right or not, that the officers can listen to your conversation through that. So, like that. But first of all, what he does is when he starts to get anxious, he gets a bit fidgety and he starts to rock backwards and forwards, and then he'll clamp his hands together like that. And then when he's really anxious, he starts to sweat around there, and then he clamps his hands together like that and he starts to rock backwards and forwards. With that, he jumps up off the bed and sort of indicated that it was somebody else, clearly Halvagis, down like either crouching or kneeling. He wasn't specific.
At this point, Fraser is on the ground, crouching as if he is the victim, Halvagis.
And then he's gone.
He points to himself and then mimes stabbing motions, bringing down his right hand as though attacking an imaginary victim.
And then he just sat back down on the bed. Face became a mask again, no clamped hands, no sweating. Conversation over. In other words, what he does, I think, is that he bottles it up, and then you can almost see the pressure building to the extent that he's completely unable to contain it any longer, and he blurts out something that immediately he has blurted it out, he regrets it, and the shutters come down again.
Since the age of 15, when Dupas was first interviewed by police over a sex offence, they realised he managed to hide his own thoughts even from himself. In his first interview, done when he was just a teenager, a policeman aggressively asked him questions about an attack he committed on a neighbour. Dupas began to shake and looked as though he was about to confess, and then all of a sudden his eyes just went dead and he said, "I don't know what you're talking about." It was as if he had a panic room in his own brain where he could hide even from himself.
After that, I was totally blown out, as you could imagine. I thought, whoa, what about this? And I must say, I left.
Was there any further admissions?
Yes, there was one additional time when we were in the garden, and we used to find all sorts of stuff in the garden, and rather than bring it to the attention of the officers, we just threw it in the bin. Too hard. If you show the officers drugs that you found in the garden, the whole joint's locked down, and you might be locked down for days, and it's just a matter of self-interest. You just threw it in the bin and we forgot about it. On this particular day, I was up against the wall of the other unit called Sirius West, and there'd been some disturbed earth, and I had a bit of a ferret around because I'm inherently nosy, being a criminal lawyer, and there was a knife, 10, 12 inches long, and it was one side of a piece of steel had been ground down. It wasn't a point like a picket fence, it was a triangle, and somebody had clearly sharpened that on the concrete floor and had a bit of tape or cloth wrapped around the end. And I said to Pete, "Oh, come and have a look at this." And he's come over and he stood there, and I can distinctly remember he was on my left. And I've got the knife in my hand, and I've gone, "Have a look at this," and he's taken it from me. And he got the same strange look on his face again that was on his face when he did the little pantomime in his cell. And I thought, oh, here we go. This is pretty dangerous territory here. And he started almost weighing the knife up for feel, or I don't know what it was. And he just started, and he said, Mersina. So I thought, here we go. I thought then, he's going to kill me, but he didn't. I just took the knife very carefully from him, and I said, well, chuck that in the bin, and I went out the next morning to make sure it was gone, don't worry. So they were essentially the three admissions.
Now, you had this evidence, but you didn't approach the police. Why not?
No, well, one, if the word gets out in jail that you're helping the coppers, you're a dead man. And it's as plain and simple as that. Add to that the fact that my case, because of what I'd done for a living, generated a huge amount of publicity and public scrutiny, and frankly, I'd had enough.
In June 2003, Fraser was moved out of the division into the mainstream of Port Phillip and then to Fulham at Sale. 2 years later, in June 2005, he was summoned to the guard post at Fulham, where a prison officer leant over and whispered that a homicide detective was on the phone. I knew exactly what the call was about before anyone spoke, Fraser would later tell me. On the line was Senior Detective Paul Scarlett. He'd spent more than a year re-investigating the Halvagis case. He checked prison records and knew that Fraser had spent more than a year in the same division as the suspect. The homicide detective made the call with no real hope of a breakthrough. His prison sources had told him Fraser had acted as the suspect's unpaid jailhouse lawyer. I was furious with him, actually. I couldn't believe he would help someone like that. I expected the call to be short. I thought he'd tell me to get lost and hang up. But when Scarlett introduced himself on the phone, Fraser simply asked, "What took you so long?" Scarlett asked if he could assist in the Halvagis case, and Fraser said, "You better come and see me." The policeman asked when he would be available, and the former lawyer responded, "Well, my diary isn't exactly full at the moment." Scarlett drove to Sale that night and was inside the prison the next morning.
And what prompted me to come forward was the homicide squad came down and spoke to me and said, well, that's all very well, but you're a dad. What about the Halvagis family? Don't they deserve some closure? And I thought, well, that's probably fair enough. And it was on the basis of that I agreed to give evidence.
It was Fraser's statement that led to Dupas's arrest and the conviction for the Mersina Halvagis murder.
A man very familiar with the legal system, Andrew Fraser, today returned to the Supreme Court. It was at Port Phillip Prison that he met convicted murderer Peter Dupas. Andrew Fraser told the court Dupas once reenacted Miss Halvagis' stabbing in his jail cell. The witness was excused from the dock and in the middle of the courtroom demonstrated how Dupas allegedly made several forceful stabbing motions. This prompted Miss Halvagis' father George to put his head in his hands. Fraser said he was the only person Dupas would confide in, and the accused became nervous in prison whenever Miss Halvagis' name was mentioned. The disgraced lawyer spent just over an hour giving evidence and will be cross-examined tomorrow.
We spoke to Paul Scarlett, who made the breakthrough in the Mersina Halvagis case.
So were you part of the task force looking at Dupas for other murders?
Yes, we had set up a task force, Operation Mikado, and it was put in place to investigate a number of murders, 6 in total, which included the murder of Mersina, Nicole, Patterson and Margaret Maher.
When Paul Coghlan started the inquest into Mersina, he said, we don't have enough. We believe it's Dupas, but we don't have enough to press charges. Do you remember that?
Yes, I do. There was a couple of occasions that we brought a brief of evidence to the APP for them to review, and at the time Mr Coghlan was the director of the APP, and it was very frustrating, but we understand his position when he did on each of those occasions say to us that there's not enough evidence to proceed at this point in time.
Paul Coghlan was kind enough to talk to us.
An enormous amount of work had been done by the case, and the amount of effort that's been put in by various groups of homicide squad detectives in this case has been immense. But we had got to a point where we just didn't have enough.
What's the standard of proof that you need to launch a murder?
I've got to be satisfied that there are reasonable prospects of conviction. A lot of work had been done in relation to Dupas to see whether there were sufficient similarities between the Margaret Maher murder, the Nicole Patterson murder, both of which he'd been convicted, and the Mersina Halvagis murder, so that we could use that evidence against him on a similar fact basis. We did an analysis of it and decided that it really wasn't quite similar enough to be ever put before a jury in that form. So we had succeeded in getting similar fact evidence before the jury in the Margaret Maher case. We didn't have any hope of getting it in front of the jury in relation to the Mersina Halvagis case. And I didn't at the time, prior to having the confession available to me, think that there were reasonable prospects of conviction.
But Paul, Scarlett and the team wouldn't take no for an answer, and they went back to the drawing board looking for more evidence.
So the investigation continued, and we systematically revisited as many witnesses as we could, and went through the information reports and just try and generally think outside the square to try and find other possible witnesses. And we were interviewing several people that Dupas had spent time with in prison. Various people had various bits of information for us, but eventually we did find one particular person who was able to offer significant assistance to the investigation, and eventually that came through for us.
Armed with the new evidence, police went back to the DPP, Paul Coghlan.
And the thing that made all the difference to us in a case that we could run was that he had confessed to Andrew Fraser, and that we were in a position to call Fraser as a witness. That is, he was out of jail, because he was never going to give evidence while he was in jail because he was so afraid for his own safety. And there never would be a case without that confession.
Coghlan said with Fraser's statements, with this new evidence that Dupas had confessed, he was prepared to charge the convicted killer with the murder of Mersina Halvagis. If you like this podcast, subscribe and rate it. Very highly, obviously. Tell your friends. I'd love you for it. Scarlett knew Dupas was unlikely to ever confess to police, which made the Fraser breakthrough all the more important.
So Dupas is a man that very much keeps his offending to himself. He doesn't talk about his offending with many people at all.
Let's jump to the interview process. You've got Dupas, and he's certainly not a forceful-looking fellow. How do you handle a bloke like that in an interview?
It's very complex to try and work out how to handle somebody like Dupas, because we don't know what triggers him, what can upset him, what would work for him. We tried various methods, setting up the room in different ways, showing him different pieces of evidence at different times. Very softly approach. There's no other way to do an interview of that type, and it's complex. He has spent so long in prison, he's effectively institutionalised as far as that prison mentality, and that is don't talk to the police. And we saw that on many occasions when he might talk to us generally as we're going, say, to and from the prison for the purpose of an interview. He would talk to us about just general conversation about previous camping trips and maybe life inside jail. But then as soon as we would go or commence the interview process, he would stop and he would just, it's like a screen goes up and he just goes blank.
I've heard that said before of him, that he, almost when he got to that point where he had to confront his own demons, if you want, that the eyes just go blank and it's just no one's home.
That's correct. When Dupas does get to the point where you think he's about to talk, that's when he does just go blank or shut off from the interview. But
the head of the homicide crew assigned to reinvestigate the murder was the legendary Jeff Maher. Jeff was the one who'd initially charged Dupas with the murder of Nicole Patterson. He also hosts a quarterly lunch for ex-homicide members. The sort of stories you hear there could peel the paint off the wall. I know, I've got the red wine stains to prove it.
I was the informant in the matter of Nicky Patterson, and that went to its Paul then became the informant in the matter of Margaret Maher, and he ran that through to its conclusion where Dupas was convicted, life no minimum, never to be released. And then Paul and I, we had these two briefs that we'd successfully prosecuted against him, and we decided that Paul and I would, when we could and had the opportunity, to work on the Halvagis brief together.
If I can jump back, you would have been there for the interview with Dupas over the Nicky Patterson murder. What was it like interviewing him, and what were your impressions of him?
We had a bit of an interviewing team. That was myself and Paul Scarlett in relation to our interviewing plan on Dupas. And interviewing Dupas always gave me the feeling that he was standing on the edge of the abyss, and he was sort of ready to fall in at any moment. But in fact, at that crucial time, he would just snap out of it and then step back from the abyss, regain composure and not say anything. So really, other than his name, rank and serial number, we didn't get really anything from him because he made no comment.
He was convicted, and on appeal the conviction was quashed and you win again. How did you feel when that conviction was quashed?
So the first trial for the murder of Mersina Halvagis, Dupas was convicted and he was imprisoned for life. He appealed, and unfortunately, eventually the matter went up to the High Court in Canberra, and Paul and I travelled up to the High Court. And as a result of that, it was quashed and returned back to Victoria for a retrial for the second trial. We did not feel good about it at all. Didn't feel good. A lot of work went into it. We thought that we covered off on all the points, and unfortunately the High Court judges, in their wisdom, sent it back, but rightfully so, and we retried it and he was convicted again. And as a result of that second trial for Mersina's murder, he appealed again, and then the matter was considered by the appeals court, and then we had to wait round for that, and then eventually we got a decision, and the appeal was chucked out, and he's doing 3 triple lives.
The justice system is based on beyond reasonable doubt and can cause frustration to investigators. Paul Scarlett explains.
The judicial process of trying to get somebody convicted for murder is quite difficult at times. The court, rightly so, tests every piece of evidence to the nth degree to ensure that they get their decision right. Not every decision will go in our favour, and that can be extremely frustrating, watching the devastation come over the family when, for in Dupas's case in particular, when the conviction was overturned after the first trial. I did wonder how George Halvagis in particular was ever going to make it through a second trial if we were going to go down that path.
And you did?
We did eventually run a second trial. This went to the decision was made in Canberra, the full bench of the High Court of Australia, that the matter will go back to trial.
In Mersina's case, her father George has been an unbelievable sort of dynamo over, 15 years now. How did you find George?
George Halvagis is an incredible man. I have so much respect for George and his entire family, the professional way that they handled themselves with the media. I know that there was a lot that they wanted to say, but they couldn't say it for fear of causing damage to the investigation. They were just such a professional family. Their level of grief was incredible, and dealing with that is difficult, but I guess what puts it in perspective for me is that if I think that I'm feeling some sort of grief as I'm going through this investigation process, imagine what the family are going through. George Halvagis has changed legislation or caused legislation to be changed and had no fear of going and knocking on Chief Commissioner's doors or politicians' doors demanding that something be done in relation to Mersina's investigation. And I understand that he's been doing this from day one of the investigation, but things didn't necessarily fall into place in our favour until a lot further down the track.
Yeah, an incredible man. What was your feelings when the jury came back and said guilty in the Mersina Halvagis case?
When the jury came back at the first trial with the verdict of guilty, there wasn't a dry eye in the courtroom. It's an emotional release for everybody in there. Of course, the family of the victim are going to be incredibly upset, but so were the prosecutors and so were the police.
What do you do afterwards? Do the crew go out and have a lunch or a dinner and debrief?
What happens after a guilty verdict comes through is the investigators will often will meet up at the local hotel, and quite often the family will come along with us and celebrate the verdict with us. It's not so much a celebration where everybody's high-fiving and happy. It's quite a sombre occasion, but it's a way of the family showing a little bit of appreciation to the investigators in those circumstances, and us also thanking the family for their support throughout the investigation, because the family, as much as the police are supporting the family through this difficult time, the family is actually supporting the police on a lot of occasions and encouraging us to keep going.
Dupas had been sentenced to 2 life sentences, one for Nicole Patterson and another for Margaret Maher. So he would never do 1 day's jail for Mersina. But the effort had been worthwhile, because for the Halvagis family, just perhaps they would get a few answers that they so desperately needed. Dupas has twice been convicted of murder and sentenced to life with no minimum. So even though now he's convicted of the Mersina Halvagis murder, he won't do 1 more day's jail time. So why bother? Why have the prosecution at all?
Well, it's a question of what view you have of justice for the Halvagis family. I must have spoken to George and the family, the Halvagis family, on, I suppose it had been in total 20 or 30 occasions over the years. And as a matter of trying to give them some certainty, some means of getting on with the rest of their lives, rather than having this hanging over them, this community owed it to them. And sometimes, if you just took a practical view of it, you'd say, oh, well, he's doing life and that's at the end of the matter. But I think we now take a different view about victims and the rights that victims have and ought to have than we might have taken in the past. There are very many old cases where people were known to have committed other murders and the matters were not proceeded with, just on the practical basis that they were already serving very big sentences or serving life. It's not a view we take anymore, because victims just have the right to see these cases brought to justice.
Dupas has been convicted now of 3 murders, but he's a suspect in 3 others. You're the most experienced person in this office. Do you believe he's committed more murders?
Oh, I think it's likely that he has committed more murders, but we need to look at where the evidence will take us.
What's your opinion of Dupas the man?
He has to be one of the most evil people we've dealt with. He worries you in the sense that he's never ever acknowledged any of his offending.
Dupas remains the suspect in 3 unsolved murders, including Kathleen Downs, 95, who was stabbed to death in a Brunswick nursing home in December 1997.
Peter Dupas was always the prime suspect for the 1997 murder of Brunswick grandmother Kathleen Downs.
Dupas, for no apparent reason, made calls to the nursing home shortly before the murder. He also made admissions to Fraser about another murder, referring to the old Sheila down the road, which prosecutors say is definitely Kathleen Downs. Andrew told us what Dupas told him about Kathleen Downs, facts that will never be put before a jury.
He's made certain other admissions to me, and but I can print that in. I can publish that in the book, but we can't say it. We were told not to. Well, I was directed by the judge not to mention the old Sheila down the road, which I took to be, pretty prejudicial. But
interestingly, they were saying, the DPP was saying he'd just been to visit his mother, and he reckons it's all connected back to some sort of hatred there, which may well be the case.
When he says, when he says cunt, he like every second word in jail's that. He just spits it out with this extraordinary venom. He clearly loathes women.
After the conviction, Fraser, who was broke, was offered serious money for a tell-all interview. He refused and stuck to our deal. Eventually, coroner Ian Gray found Dupas was the killer of Kathleen Downs.
In 2015, former State Coroner Ian Gray found that the serial killer had struck again. I am satisfied that the death of Miss Kathleen Downs was a result of the actions of Mr. Peter Dupas.
Dupas was charged, but the case had to be dropped because Fraser is now too ill to testify.
But the case against Dupas collapsed last year when star witness, disgraced lawyer Andrew Fraser, became too sick to testify.
The prosecution has been discontinued. There is no chance that that will ever be revisited.
Dupas is already serving 3 life sentences for the murders of 3 women: Margaret Maher in Somerton, Mersina Halvagis at Fawkner Cemetery, and Nicole Patterson in Northcote. But Kathleen Downs' family will never see him given extra jail time for the evil he inflicted on the loving grandmother as she slept in her bed.
How frustrating was it at times to think, I know he did it. I know he did it, but I might never get the chance to put it to a jury.
I think when an investigator is absolutely sure that a person has committed a crime and it's looking like that we're not going to find enough evidence to bring the matter before a court, or we do bring it before the court and the court finds that person not guilty, it's incredibly frustrating, and it's something that you won't let go of. You never let go of it, and it's the victims that you remember. Really, not so much the offender, it's the victims and the grief that has been caused to the victims. That's what you remember.
The Halvagis family had their day in court, and as long as we're prepared to support people like the decent Halvagis family against true evil like Dupas, we remain a civilised society. Dupas is rotting in jail and expected to die there. Andrew Fraser rebuilt his life, but he's now seriously ill with cancer. Paul Scarlett now investigates cold case murders, hoping to give other relatives some form of resolution as he did for the Halvagises. Jeff Maher has retired, but he still goes to the police academy, helping teach the next generation of investigators. He goes hunting, drives a muscle car, and organises lunches. Bloody good ones too. Naked City is brought to you by The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald. Subscriptions power our newsroom, so to support independent journalism, consider subscribing to the Sydney Morning Herald or The Age. This episode was produced and edited by Anu the Axe Hasbolt. It was mixed by Cool Hand Cormac Lally. Archives by 9 and 3AW. Tom McKendrick is head of audio. I'm John Sylvester. Thanks for listening.